Hey guys, it's Jayden Clark here from Jazz Lesson Videos, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about making dominant chords sound more scary. Now, of course, there's plenty of different ways we can actually play the dominant chord. It's one of those chords in which we can virtually play pretty much anything over it as long as we resolve to that one chord just okay. But we're going to focus on the diminished scale here in this video, and more specifically, the half-whole diminished scale. Now, this is one of those sounds in which, when used correctly, can make one's playing sound so much more sophisticated, and of course, we can create much more tension over those dominant chords. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about how to apply the diminished scale, how to actually put together the half-whole diminished scale, and the exercises that we check out today and more can be found in two great packages written by Chad L.B. These packages are 15 exercises for diminished scale technique and 65 shredding diminished phrases. If you want to go ahead and check any of those downloads out, feel free to go ahead and click the link below. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the first exercise. So with this first exercise, we're going to be taking a look at some diminished arpeggios, but just very quickly before we do that, let's go ahead and take a closer look at the half-whole diminished scale. Of course, as the name suggests, we are moving in half steps and whole steps in that order. So we're going half step, whole step, half step, whole step to make up the scale. And this actually makes the scale totally symmetrical, which is kind of nice when it comes to filling out a whole measure. Of course, another thing to note about the diminished scale, and of course this applies to the half-whole diminished scale, is that there are only three completely different transpositions, meaning that there are only three completely different sets of notes that you can learn in order to play the half-whole diminished scale from every single note. Now, an example of that is, of course, take C half-whole diminished, C sharp half-whole diminished, and D half-whole diminished, and all the notes from those various scales. If you were to go up to E flat half-whole diminished, you're using the exact same notes as C diminished. If you go up to E half-whole diminished, you're using the exact same notes as C sharp. If you go up to F half-whole diminished, you're using the exact same notes as D half-whole diminished. Of course, that continues. So you have three completely different transpositions, which is useful to know because you might find it a little easier to actually take this through the keys because of that. So, to this arpeggio exercise. Now let's go ahead and actually take a listen to it. Of course, what's happening is we are building fully diminished 7 arpeggios from every single note in the half-whole diminished scale. Now, if you actually look closely, really what you're doing is you're using two completely different diminished 7 arpeggios, and you're kind of alternating between the two. Look at C diminished arpeggio and D flat diminished arpeggio, for example. And then look at E flat diminished arpeggio using the exact same notes as C diminished arpeggio. You move up a half step to E diminished arpeggio, like we mentioned just earlier, using the exact same notes as D flat diminished arpeggio. And you see that alternating back and forth as you move up, and the same thing when you're moving down as well. And in my opinion, if you keep that pattern in mind, it just makes an exercise like this a little bit easier to process and take through the keys. Of course, with that, an exercise like this is going to help you really internalize that diminished sound, and of course give you a little bit more flexibility across your instrument with the diminished scale itself. So moving on to our next exercise here, now we're going to be looking at a diatonic exercise. So let's just jump straight into it and have a listen. Okay, so looking at this particular exercise here now, we're actually moving 1, 2, 3, 5 up the half-whole diminished scale on those first two beats. And if you look at the rest of the measures, at least when we're ascending, this happens throughout the pattern. So thinking diatonically, we're thinking 1, 2, 3, 5, starting from each note in the half-whole diminished scale. Of course, the second 2 beats in each measure, we're actually just moving down the scale, and of course this allows us to lead up and by, well, either half step or whole step depending where you are in the scale, but it allows us to voice lead up nicely to the next note in the half whole diminished scale. Of course, when we're descending, it's actually exactly the same. We just voice lead down to the next note in the half whole diminished scale rather than up. So again, you can see we've got that 1, 2, 3, 5 in the first 2 beats, and then we simply descend down the half whole diminished scale in the second 2 beats, and this happens as we descend diatonically down the half whole diminished scale. Of course, if you get something like this blazing through the keys and up to tempo, it's going to be super, super great for our technique, and you'll find that it will allow us to play much more interesting lines with the half whole diminished scale, and that really goes for all of the exercises we're going to check out here in this video. Okay, so in this next exercise here now, we're actually going to be adding some chromaticism. So this is going to be a half whole diminished approach note exercise. So let's go ahead and actually take a listen to that one here now. Okay, so taking a closer look at this exercise now, we've got that same 1, 2, 3, 5, we can call it a cell, diminished cell if we want, at the beginning of each measure. But instead of simply descending down the diminished scale like we did in our last exercise, what we're doing is we're adding a chromatic enclosure to the next note in the half whole diminished scale. Of course, we can see that D natural in the first measure there. Of course, it's not a note that's in the half whole diminished scale, rather it's being used as a chromatic note as a part of that 3-note enclosure. You can see that E flat, D natural, C, wrapping the D flat there on beat 1 of the next measure. If you take a closer look at the ascending version of the pattern, you can see that enclosure happening in every single measure. A really, really nice way to get used to voice leading to different notes in the half whole diminished scale. Now, if we look at the descending version, it's slightly different. What we're doing is we're simply going 1, 2, 3, 4 up the scale before descending and using that exact same 3-note enclosure pattern to voice lead to the next note in the half whole diminished scale. And of course, that exact same thing happens as we descend down the scale. Of course, like I mentioned earlier, you can find all of these exercises and much, much more on the Jazz Lesson Videos website in great resources written by Chad LB. Those first 3 that we checked out can be found in the 15 exercises for diminished scale technique. Now we're going to go ahead and actually look at some phrases. So this can be found in the 65 shredding diminished phrases, both of which you can find in the links below. Of course, when we go ahead and learn any new scale, along with doing exercises like we've just looked at, our technique exercises, learning them through 12 keys and pushing the tempo, I find it really helpful to go ahead and learn phrases that utilize the scale that we're learning. So the first phrase we're looking at is a short one, just over a C7 flat 9 chord. Of course, the half whole diminished scale really suits this chord. Of course, it suits any dominant chord, quite frankly, but if we're looking for a chord that is going to fit very, very nicely, fit pretty much exactly with the notes from the half whole diminished scale, the C7 flat 9, C7 flat 9, flat 13, they're going to be really, really suitable for this particular scale. So let's go ahead and take a listen to this first phrase. Okay, so quickly taking a look at the notes in this phrase now. As we can see, we're starting from the root. We're simply moving up a few notes in the half whole diminished scale. In fact, we're moving, it looks like it's 1, 2, 3, 6, and then we're landing on the 5th note of the half whole diminished scale there on beat 3. So from beat 3 there, we stay diatonic within the half whole diminished scale with that E flat, E, G before landing on the 7, or the flat 7, of the chord on beat 1 of that next measure. Once again, we remain diatonic before we get to that B natural. The B natural sort of just adding a nice little color tone in there before we go flat 3 to the 1. Of course, another couple of notes in that half whole diminished scale, making it nice and tense, nice and scary if we're thinking about it that way. So let's go ahead and expand upon that last phrase a little more by adding some chromaticism and actually making the phrase a little bit longer. So here we're going to check out a chromatic phrase. Let's go ahead and hear what that sounds like. So as we can see in this phrase, we're actually starting it the exact same way. We're going 1, 2, 3, 6, if we're referring to the notes in the half-whole diminished scale. Before we descend back down the scale, we've got that D natural as a chromatic note. We sort of chromatically enclose the flat 3 on beat 1 of that next measure. And as we can see, we've got another 3-note enclosure. We're enclosing that 6, which of course is the 5 of the chord, but of course the 6 in the half-whole diminished scale, before we move diatonically up the half-whole diminished, and of course that leads nicely to the root note on beat 1 of bar 3. Of course we can see another chromatic enclosure leading to that A natural there on beat 3 of bar 3, before we then once again enclose the root on beat 1 of that final measure. And of course we can also see that in that final measure there, the great thing about the half-whole diminished scale, we still get those chord tones in there. So we've got the root note, the 5th, the 3rd, we've got the flat 9, of course, addressing the flat 9 of the chord before we then resolve once again to the root note there on beat 3. Okay, let's move on to a major 2-5-1 phrase now that utilizes the half-whole diminished scale over that 5 chord. So let's take a listen to that phrase here now. Okay, so already we probably noticed something interesting going on, and that is that we actually start playing the half-whole diminished scale, the G half-whole diminished scale, over the 2 chords. So we're anticipating that 5 chord. In my opinion, this sounds really, really hip, and it's always something you can do. You can go ahead and anticipate that 5 chord. You can even anticipate the 1 chord if you wanted to from that 5 chord, as long as you resolve smoothly, which this phrase absolutely does. We can see it resolving nicely to the 3rd of beat 1 of bar 3. Of course, lines up nicely with that 1 chord there. So let's quickly take a look at the notes. Of course, I might actually start from beat 3 of the first measure. So of course, we've already had that B flat there leading in to the G natural, and here we start our half-whole diminished sound. So the half-whole diminished scale allows us to chromatically enclose that B flat there on beat 1 of bar 2. And of course, we can utilize some of that arpeggio sound. You've got that B natural, D natural, F natural up to the B flat. Of course, this leads nicely downwards and by step to the 3rd of the 1 chord there in bar 3. And of course, when we resolve, we're just playing nice and diatonic, which sounds great after playing something that's a little more tense, a little more scary, like the half-whole diminished scale there on the 5 chord. Okay, so the 4th and final phrase that we're going to check out, of course, is a minor 2-5-1. Now, I find the half-whole diminished scale to be super, super useful over the minor 2-5-1, because oftentimes you're going to have an altered dominant chord, and the half-whole diminished scale works really, really well over dominant chords with any alterations. Like we mentioned earlier in the video, works over any dominant chord, but of course fits nicely with 7, dominant 7, flat 9, dominant 7, flat 9, flat 13. Even if you see a sharp 9, sharp 5, it's going to sound just fine. I mean, maybe the altered scale might sound a little better, but generally the half-whole diminished scale is a one-size-fits-all dominant chord option, and we can absolutely use it for all of them. So, listening to this minor 2-5-1 phrase now, let's go ahead and take a look. So, just quickly going over the notes here now. In that first measure, of course, we're using the Locrian scale, so the 7th mode of the major scale, to address that D half diminished 7. Of course, this leads nicely downward and by half step to the 6 of the 5 chord. Now, an interesting thing that's happening with this particular phrase is that the first 2 beats of the dominant chord, we're actually using a different half-whole diminished scale. We're sort of continuing on that sound that starts in the first measure. So I'm looking at it from that C natural on beat 3. We actually descend down the C half-whole diminished scale. Now, this is okay. It's not the half-whole diminished scale that you would usually use over the 5 chord, but as you can see, it leads so nicely to that B flat there on beat 3 of bar 2. that we're then able to transition to our usual G half-whole diminished scale, and you can see that diminished arpeggio that leads really, really nicely to the 7th on beat 1 of bar 3. And of course, once we resolve, we're using that nice melodic minor sound over the minor chord. So we've covered so much half-whole diminished material in this video, so if you would like to go ahead and extend yourself, do feel free to check out the 15 exercises for diminished scale technique and the 65 shredding diminished phrases PDF packages written by Chad LB. You can go ahead and check them out in the link in the description. Of course, with all of this stuff, memory is key, and whenever we're learning any different sound, any different scale, we do want to focus on all 12 keys. It's going to be super, super useful for actually allowing for this stuff to come out in our playing. So thank you so much for watching. Do feel free to click the like, the subscribe, and absolutely let us know if there are any other topics that you would like us to cover on this channel. So with all of that, I hope you're able to make your dominant chord sound a little more scary. Take care, and I'll see you next time.